Hey there and welcome to this series on personality. This particular video is going to be centered on the trait of neuroticism, which is all about negative emotion. In the previous videos I covered personality more generally, and then the most recent video was all about the personality trait of extroversion, which, as we've seen, is all about positive emotion. The first thing to note is that on average we are more sensitive to negative emotion than we are to positive emotion, and this is an unfortunate side effect of our evolutionary past, where dangers lurked around every corner, and therefore the people who were sensitive and aware of the potential dangers, therefore experienced more negative emotion, survived more frequently. This gives rise to the phenomena such as negativity bias, where even in modern scenarios such as consuming news feeds, we are more sensitive to the negative events in the world than we are to the positive ones, which is why many companies capitalize on this, especially media corporations such as news corporations, and they end up propagating more negative news as we are more prone to react to it and therefore consume it. Even though on average we're more sensitive to negative emotion, we do find large variances among the population, and we can even measure this by subjecting various people to both positive imagery and negative imagery, and those who experience more of a positive mood when exposed to positive imagery tend to be higher on the trait extroversion, whereas those who experience more of a negative mood after being exposed to negative imagery tend to be higher on neuroticism. But what exactly is neuroticism, and what are the telling signs that someone is high on this trait? Well, people with high neuroticism tend to experience more frustration, disappointment, grief, pain, threat, uncertainty, anxiety, shame, and guilt. These, along with many other negative emotions, all encompass neuroticism, but as we'll see, we can break neuroticism down into two subtraits. Just like we did with extroversion, we're now going to break down neuroticism into its two core subtraits, and the first of which is withdrawal, which is more about the anticipation of potential future negative events. The other subtrait is volatility, and this is more about how you actually experience negative emotion in response to something negative. So think of it more about how you experience negative emotion in the present, and then withdrawal is more about how you expect things to be in times of uncertainty. More specifically though, people with high withdrawal are anxiety prone, self-conscious, depressive, easily overwhelmed, and those with low withdrawal tend to be calm, reasonably happy, and self-confident. Then people with high volatility tend to be touchy, easily irritated, unstable, and prone to bursts of anger, whereas people with low volatility tend to be stable, easygoing, and non-reactive. And one of the best examples you can see with people with high volatility is how they react to things such as traffic. They often get easily agitated and frustrated, whereas someone with low volatility seem to remain calm despite these circumstances. Going back to withdrawal briefly though, what it seems to actually measure is your freeze response in anticipation of potential danger. So when you think of a situation like a rabbit in front of a headlight, they often freeze because this is their evolutionary adaptation in response to predators. In humans, we've evolved a similar mechanism, but it's less specific to predators and more general to our goals and the potential dangers that exist in the world. As I mentioned in the previous video, pretty much everything we do has some kind of implied goal or desired outcome, and therefore our ability to move closer to that goal or back away is very much related to positive and negative emotion. Positive emotion pushes us closer towards our goals, whereas negative emotion either keeps us frozen or makes us run away, which is related to the whole concept of fight or flight. If you think about it though, when we experience this freeze response, and you'll know how this feels if you've ever suffered from some kind of crippling anxiety, it's not simply that nothing is going on. Instead, our heart rate is elevated, and what we're really doing is preparing to make a move. This is why we feel tense. Our muscles are preparing to make a move because of some potential danger. Another point I made previously is that no matter where you sit on any of the big 5 traits, there are pros and cons associated with that particular value. So the same is true with negative and positive emotion in general. It might seem like it's objectively the case that it's good to experience lots of positive emotion and bad to experience lots of negative emotion. But as we'll see, it's not quite as simple as that, and both serve many important purposes. We've covered the role of positive emotion in the last video, so now we're going to go through a bunch of the different reasons why negative emotion exists and what it aims to accomplish. One of the more general purposes of negative emotion is to help us avoid some kind of potential pain, and this can be seen in anxiety, where one of the main points of anxiety is to replace the potential pain or damage that we would experience in the real world, and instead replace that with a different type of negative feeling that prevents us from actually going ahead and getting ourselves into that kind of situation in the first place. So if you think about it, anxiety is a proxy for potential pain, and pain is a proxy for some kind of physical or psychological damage. Another variant of negative emotion is defensive aggression, and this also functions as some kind of protective mechanism against injury. However, one of the main purposes of negative emotion is for sociological reasons, and I like to think of this more like a smoke detector. If you think about it, what is the point of a smoke detector? Well, it's there to alert you about some kind of potential danger, and when it comes to smoke detectors, there are two potential things that could go wrong. The first of these is a false positive, and this basically just means that the smoke detector goes off even though there's no actual danger. And while this is inconvenient, it's not really the end of the world. And the other thing that could go wrong is a false negative, and this basically just means that it doesn't go off even though it should because of an actual dangerous situation. The consequences of this, though, are much more extreme, because if you don't pick up on some kind of potential negative event, it could end up costing you your life or your safety. Now you might be wondering, what does this smoke detector analogy got to do with neuroticism? Well, actually, it serves a very similar purpose when it comes to a group setting. So if you think of a tribe, if you have one or more people with a high sensitivity to negative events, then they will alert the rest of the tribe as to the potential dangers and what could possibly go wrong. Now, the unfortunate consequence of having someone with a high sensitivity to negative emotion is that most of the time, the threat that they will perceive is either exaggerated or even non-existent. But the very few times where they correctly pick up on some kind of negative event or threat, it can actually be life-saving. However, it's worth pointing out that most of these detections of perceived threats were calibrated and optimized for our evolutionary past. So in modern times, it's not to say that threat or dangers don't exist, but we live in a much more safe and secure environment, and therefore it's going to happen even more so that they're going to pick up on things that are less dangerous than they actually are. So how much negative emotion is appropriate is very much dependent on the kinds of environments you find yourself in and your circumstances. And for some people, it's actually correct to experience some kind of negative emotion because it can get you out of some kind of danger or prevent you from even getting there in the first place. However, this kind of crippling anxiety or crippling level of negative emotion can often have negative consequences as well. If you remember back to what I was saying about high levels of negative emotion can often cause you to kind of go into that freeze-like state, well, imagine you end up getting into some kind of negative scenario where someone you know around you experiences some kind of accident or injury. Well, the last thing you want to experience is a freeze-like state where nothing happens and you're unable to attend to them. However, there are also consequences for people who don't experience enough negative emotion, and you can see this in people who have a high capacity or appetite for dangerous activities. Because they're not experiencing much neuroticism or withdrawal, their anticipation of danger is little or none, and therefore they're more likely to get themselves into dangerous situations and actually get injured or even die from doing so. There's also a more subtle psychological consequence of not experiencing any or much negative emotion, and we can see this when we look at someone who has experienced some kind of loss in their life. Maybe one of their loved ones has passed away, and if they experience little or no negative emotion in response to this, then it sort of comes across to everyone else as if they don't have much empathy or they don't have that kind of basic human response to such events. Of course, this isn't actually true, but at the same time, we often resonate with people who act in the appropriate negative way when something negative happens to them. And we see this all the time in movies and TV shows where we resonate with people on an emotional level because we can connect with their negative feelings or the sadness or happiness or whatever it may be. People who experience the right kinds of perceived negative and positive emotions are easier to relate to overall. So what happens when we experience too much negative emotion and this lasts in an unhealthy and unhelpful way on a chronic level? Well, this can give rise to things such as depression or various kinds of anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders are characterized by extreme levels of worry, feelings of panic, and that overall sensation of catastrophe. Now, it is worth mentioning that there is a difference between someone who experiences or suffers from chronic or clinical depression versus someone who actually just has a really unfortunate time, is going through a lot of difficulties, or in some cases, their entire life is filled with tragedy. In this latter case, while it might not necessarily be productive to experience so much negative emotion, at the same time, you can't exactly say it's inappropriate to experience it given their particular circumstances. What these people need is some kind of helping hand or social support to help them get through these moments. However, if there's a large disparity between your current circumstances and your feelings towards it, then this could be indicative of something else, and it could be some kind of depressive or anxiety disorder. In the case of anxiety disorders, one of the best things and most helpful things in alleviating these symptoms is voluntary confrontation with the stimulus or the triggers that cause it in the first place. As I alluded to earlier, what anxiety really is a method of dealing with or avoiding some kind of uncertainty. Again, if anxiety causes you to freeze or run away, then you won't end up having to face the big metaphorical predator that exists on the other side of your imagination. Because your imagination is often blowing things out of proportion and causing you to think of something in an overly catastrophic way, then one of the most helpful ways to deal with this is to prove to yourself that it's not actually as bad as you think it is. And this can't be done by forcing someone into the situation against their will. It has to be voluntary, because only then will they truly comprehend what it is that they've been fearing and what actually exists in reality. So 3 things you can do if you experience some kind of anxiety disorder, and some of this applies more broadly to a range of different negative scenarios. The first of which is voluntary confrontation. The other is to take baby steps. If you set yourself unachievable goals, then you'll often feel more disappointed and deflated, and this can actually exacerbate those feelings of depression or anxiety in the first place. And the last one is to develop a routine, because through this routine, you'll be able to stabilize different areas of your life, and that avoids the uncertainty, and therefore you can focus your energy and time into the few small things that are actually uncertain that you've been fearing or that you've been putting off. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when dealing with people who experience high levels of anxiety or depression is to make comparisons with other people, to say things such as you should feel grateful for what you have, and to compare yourself with other people who are below you, who have it worse and have done something about it. All this does is reinforce the belief that they already have that they're not worth helping, and therefore they're not going to go to any kind of trouble to help themselves because they don't actually feel like they're worth it. Often these people who experience this level of crippling or clinical depression also experience high amounts of pain, and therefore there are some activities or things that you can do that lessens the pain and act as some kind of painkiller. The first of these is human or social contact, and this can even be seen with babies, and one of the main reasons why they cling on to their mother or father is because that feeling of proximity or even being cuddled actually lowers their threshold and feelings of pain and distress. Anyway, that's all for this one. If you have any questions or suggestions, then definitely leave them down in the comments. I may make a follow-up video after I've completed all of the big 5 personality traits based on questions, suggestions, or even things that I haven't quite covered in the previous videos. So definitely let me know there, and also feel free to let me know how you score on various traits by taking either of the 2 tests that I've linked in the description. As always, if you got something from this video, I'd really appreciate if you could like and subscribe. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.